Thanks for joining us once again. Today's talk focuses on the fact that the BYD semi is surrendering to the Tesla semi in the cold of Canada. We also take some time to look at what BYD is doing in buses because they've had a lot more success in that space. Now we actually have some footage running of the semi in action, but unfortunately um, there's some conflict between camera and our videos, so we're going to shut that one off. This is Greg for Tesla Fan Insight. Thanks once again for joining us. If this is your first time on our channel, welcome. If you're a repeat visitor, welcome back. I also wanted to just thank our subscribers. We'd appreciate it if you would do so as well. And we also wanted to thank our Patreon supporters. Without you, our channel doesn't work at all. So one of our great benefits for our channel is that we actually have a lot of subscribers who are very knowledgeable and will actually pitch questions or criticisms of our show that actually end up benefiting us. In this case, one of the things that came up was that we actually had a commenter on our last show that indicated that the China deployment of electric trucks had already occurred, whereas in the United States, we're just getting started when it comes to electric vehicles, and in particular, electric semi-trucks. So one of the interesting sort of phenomenons that happened was we went back to take a look at, so basically what happened with the Tesla Semi was in 2017, in November, when Elon Musk first announced in April and then delivered prototypes in November 17th to be exact. There was a flurry of it's not possible to do the truck initially, and then by November, when Elon demonstrated the trucks, all of a sudden there were a large number of manufacturers that quickly scurried to try to respond to the threat that electric trucks might represent to pre-existing entities like a Mercedes, which is 40% of it, or Daimler-Benz, which represents 40% of the global truck production, as well as Cummins. All of the sort of majors, including BYD, sort of came into the discussion. So we went back to take a look at, well, what's been going on in electric semis? In this case, we're focused on what's going on with BYD. So you'll notice that the thumbnail we've chosen references an electric BYD truck with the name Loblaw on the door. Loblaw is a Canadian grocery chain, and they basically have, I believe, 25 Tesla semi-trucks on order, and they also decided to embrace trying out the BYD electric semi in their system as well. So what ended up happening is that the folks at BYD have an assembly plant in a place called Lancaster, California. They've assembled, from what we can tell, about 300 buses over the last 4 or 5 years, manufactured in China, parts shipped to LA or Lancaster, put together there, and they're on a series of short and long-term trials when it comes to buses and possibly trucks. We actually saw an example of a BYD garbage truck that's being used in the Bay Area, I believe in Palo Alto, California. So BYD, to sort of push ahead of Tesla when it came to trucks in Canada, actually announced that they were going to be building an assembly plant in Canada. The Ontario government announced a $75,000 per vehicle tax credit to help facilitate the success of these electric semis. So all seemed like it was going really well. What then happened was something very interesting, which is the folks at Loblaw elected to do a November start of the trials of the BYD trucks. And the net result of this was that um, uh, the the trial that was set up was that there was to be a truck that moved between a distribution center um, 35 miles out of town to a grocery store, and it was a full 53-foot trailer on that electric vehicle. So after, I believe, 6 months of trial, the whole thing was shut down, and the project was basically canceled. I'm going to take one quick break here. Yes, we want better sound. So what ended up happening was this trial was tested out, and there were no announcements made by Loblaw how the trial went. But BYD immediately announced that they were suspending the construction of an assembly facility for trucks in Canada, and it was unknown what the date would be when trucks would be available. But in essence, um, the, the concept was canceled. So what wasn't canceled, however, is that BYD announced that they're actually building a truck facility in Canada, and that truck facility, I'm sorry, a bus facility instead of a truck facility. And the buses, or the bus solution of BYD, which 300 had been built at Lancaster plant, is now initially being tested with buses from Lancaster, California, and then in Canada, the assembly facility there will help provide the initial prototypes for different cities in Canada, and then subsequently the actual operating buses that would be put in place. So we thought this was really interesting, and as you'll notice on our thumbnail, we described the fact that there was a surrender by the folks at BYD when it came to one, um, they weren't going to do any trucks. Two, they are doing buses. And we'll get into a discussion of what's happening with the buses, but we're supposed to be focused in this show on what's happening with trucks. But in essence, the problems that are seen by everyone, including Tesla, is whatever your anticipated range was, cut that range in the 20 to 40% range, proportional to how cold it is. So the colder it gets, the less range you're going to get off of that vehicle based on the battery conditioning process. And by the way, this is also at the high end, at the hotter it gets. So we have a bunch of data that was provided on buses, but let's stay within trucks for this portion of the show. In a couple of minutes, we'll dive into data flow that's been coming off of the buses. So one of the things that came up is that the initial range for the BYD truck that was listed was about 130 miles. The gap between the facilities, in this case for Loblaw, was approximately 35 miles. So what basically happened is that it became clear based on what's happening from both sides that the BYD vehicle was unable to make this work. And it's our sense that one of the problems is clearly the Canadian winters are brutal, so anyone going there has to have a lot of excess range in the battery packs used, because the colder it gets, the more conditioning energy will be used to warm up the batteries so that they can operate. And in this case, based on the cancellation of the test, it's clear that there was a surrender in that Loblaw and BYD determined that the truck was inadequate to make the routine runs between store and distribution center that was mandated for the nature of conditions that were in Canada. Now, we have an earlier show we actually did on this partnership, and our conclusion then was that for a 100-mile-ish range truck, and when you're entering an environment that hits below zero often, it would probably be a bad combination and would not work. And I was surprised to find out that's the case. So for those of you who actually articulated the fact that, you know, BYD slash the Chinese already deployed trucks, yes, they've deployed them, but if you're not in optimal operating conditions, there's a good chance that that deployed solution may not work as planned. And this is an illustration of that. The flip side of this is just looking at Tesla, for example. We've often talked about the fact that when Tesla's running tests on the trucks, they're actually not running into the below freezing mountains during the winter months. And as we've shared with you, our conclusion was that between the energy used dealing with the elevations of the mountains combined with the freezing temperatures, that reduction in battery range makes it problematic to find charging or get to charging facilities efficiently during the winter. But during the summer, we're seeing regular trips by these vehicles through those mountains. The next thing related to this is we wanted to review kind of three situations relative to the BYD, but in this case, the buses. The first is a place called Albuquerque, New Mexico. It was determined, the specs on the presentation from BYD indicated that Albuquerque would be able to get 277 miles of range on their buses. Albuquerque purchased the buses with this agreement. I believe it's a 100 million plus contract. What they found was they were actually getting about 177 miles of range on these electric buses. And there were two problems. One was that over the primary bus line that they were using, the elevation transition was about 1,000 feet. And then you add in issues relative to temperatures, and that combination meant that you had to end up with a long delay in the middle of the run in order to address recharge. So in the case of Albuquerque, they canceled the contract, sued BYD, and switched to diesel buses because it was deemed that the electric route were probably not a good idea currently. And this brings up another data point on these buses is that they were being tried in a place called Minneapolis, Minnesota. And as you recall, during the Super Bowl, one of the buses that they had that was supposed to be of similar range, they were getting about 40 minutes of time that the bus was on the road when temperatures dropped to 5 below. So, the issue that everyone is still having with buses is that, yes, they work great in warmer temperatures when you get to at freezing and then below freezing. The amount of time that's used in order to recharge these buses is an issue. And then the range, while the bus is trying to warm itself and warm the cabin, ends up getting very short. So in theory, what we read was the fact that right now there's a process where you almost have to buy 2 electric buses for each of the diesel buses you might have used in the past, because if you don't have supercharging ability, you still have to make the route runs. And the only way to do that might be to park one bus, let it charge while the other bus is running, and then just keep making that transition if you're in a 24-hour or very long-term operating situation. So this is kind of interesting to us because in a place called Shenzhen, China, they've actually switched completely to electric buses by BYD, and BYD enjoys a huge taxi fleet related to electric buses as well. So it's a bit of surprise to see a giant company like BYD that has a great reputation when it comes to delivering electric products in China, but they're a bit stumbling as they enter real world operations when it comes globally. So in essence, right now, Loblaw has 2 choices. One is to try to wait for BYD to catch up and then go back to those buses. The other is to ride the Tesla semis to see them in operation in different circumstances and extrapolate how that might work in their environment. And at this point, we haven't heard of any cancellations relative to the Tesla semis, so that's why we concluded that on the BYD side, there's a surrender. And, you know, we think it's unfortunate because it'd be nice to see more electric buses / trucks out there of different types. In the case of garbage trucks, the distance run by a truck is fairly short. So that solution for the current iteration of batteries that they have is a likely better solution than we're currently seeing. Frankly, the other data point is that in the case of Lancaster, California, producing 300 buses over a 5-year period is kind of a stunner that they could afford to keep a facility open with that little production. But it was also noted that currently they have as many as 80 buses that are being put together to be shipped to sort of U.S. destinations for customers that are buying. And they're also putting together a facility relative to sales that are starting to accelerate in the Canadian market. So hats off to them in terms of both situations, in terms of getting more vehicles out there. I guess I'm really fascinated right now because there's a fascinating process happening, which I call the difference between an introduction of a great new product that's going to work great and the reality of the operating environment in terms of what really happens. And as we can see from this example, you know, as Tesla enters China, it's a fascinating circumstance because sort of one of the statements that's being made by how intense the support is from the Chinese government is that there's actually a problem that's going on between customers and what was promised relative to electric vehicles being purchased and actually what the experience of customers is. So customers are not saying, you know, the cars are terrible or anything like that. They're just buying them in small numbers and enduring sort of the challenges that startup companies in the 2 to 3 years in the electric vehicle business are experiencing as they try to get their products out there. So sort of the hidden comment that's being made is basically, why not go with Tesla? Because China has made the effort to do electric vehicles on its own, and it's been somewhat successful in that a lot of vehicles were sold. But the reality is that if you're bringing in Tesla in and bringing them in, you know, on the red carpet as they're being given treatment in Shanghai, it's very clear that all the things that Tesla does relative to delivering solutions to customers are really appreciated. I was actually really impressed by the fact that both in Europe, Canada, and other places, Tesla's success in delivering electric vehicles with all kinds of excellent operating properties is actually influencing the thinking of legislators who are deciding on whether or not you should try to move towards the electric solution. And the problem is that while they're being influenced by Teslas that they see or drive or that experience, as well as experiencing it via news, other entities like a BYD, for example, are enjoying the halo effect or the glow of the potential of electric. As we were doing our research, there are a few sort of data points that popped up that I was surprised by, impressed by, and that didn't know about. For example, Thomas Edison. So there was a point around 1910 in the United States where there was actually a legitimate battle between whether or not the automobiles were going to be more heavily electric versus ICE. And for a period there, electric vehicles are actually ahead of ICE vehicles in terms of number of vehicles on the road. The problem that popped up, though, was range. Thomas Edison was trying to set up a number of charging facilities for these electric vehicles, and the range lack of anxiety and range ease of the diesel or gasoline vehicles, in essence, put the lights out on this solution. The next, so That's a fact I didn't know. Another fact I didn't know I thought was really interesting, and it's being implemented more in Europe than the United States, is that um, it turns out that um, there are a number of solutions one can use to the problem of charging that we described. So in Europe, European cities using electric vehicles, particularly buses, heavily. One solution is to have a wire above the bus. Another way to do things is have a hybrid bus that's able to work off the wire, get off the wire for a short period of time, and then come back onto the wire so that it can get powered up. And I kind of like hearing about this solution because it gives a way for vehicles that might need to be charged up, a way to do so, but also a way for them to operate in areas that they're not going to be charged. So it addresses the issue of, hey, it costs more to do an electric vehicle, but there's a way to get it done that's viable. We should also note that electric buses are easier than trucks because, as you know, there's a very flat surface that's broad that you can work with there. The routes don't tend to be as long as trucks or as distant from sort of charging facilities. So it's an interesting combination of issues. So as Tesla is entering China, it's very clear that yes, there are a lot of Chinese electric vehicles being sold, but it's also not clear that at a reasonable price point, the demand has been satiated there with quality solutions. And so as we were now starting to get some data on, well, what are the folks at BYD doing? And we're seeing them retreating from situations where electric trucks have challenges and their battery technologies does not get it done. It's a really fascinating collection of information because um, I've consistently been amazed, and our channel has really benefited from the fact that there's a huge difference between saying you have an electric vehicle on the road and saying that that vehicle is viable in every way and meets customer needs in a fashion that the customers are happy with short and long term. And I believe that what's happened between Loblaw and BYD illustrates that. Um, the other, I guess, note on the BYD test that went on with Loblaw is the fact that BYD is building buses in Ontario currently, and that bus plant could eventually go back to trucks once the battery technology that they're doing rolls out. I particularly wanted to focus on BYD today because given that they're actually selling until the Model 3 more electric vehicles than Tesla, illustrates the fact that they're an important entity to be reckoned with short and long term, and we look forward to them sort of modifying the structure of their batteries to facilitate them being competitive with everything in the world as entities get step-by-step progress. So the answer is yes, China has deployed electric trucks and buses, and in theory should be ahead of Tesla, et cetera. The reality is that there are a lot of folks benefiting from the Tesla electric success that are really not ready for prime time, but are garnering sort of huge contracts, assuming that they can deliver, if you will, on the Tesla process. And it really does bring up the question, what about putting some of those uh, batteries from a semi in a bus and see what happens? And you get the range, but I believe that the biggest thing for these municipalities is the supercharger ability of the battery packs produced by Tesla, reducing the number of buses needed so that you could have some downtime of a half hour during the regular run, which is a reasonable time for buses to change drivers or get a break, and those vehicles come back online. So Tesla has avoided any discussion of buses, with the closest being uh, their discussion with Mercedes-Benz about trying to take Sprinter and change them into Tesla electric vans has been a conversation Elon Musk has had numerous times. The general plan of Tesla has been to avoid working sort of in areas where there are solutions that are pretty good and that don't add a lot of value because everything that they're doing tends to work better in other circumstances, if you will, or more difficult circumstances. For example, the challenges of trucks moving freight over decent range distances is a niche that a lot of folks haven't solved. We could actually go back to the fact that um, the sub 100-mile electric vehicle has been around for 20 or 30 years in heavy use in Asian countries. So it's an interesting circumstance, and we found that it'd be fun to see how things are going for Loblaw slash the rapid to market process of BYD with vehicles, and the answer is they had to shut everything down because of how badly the tests worked. And once they get their Tesla semis, having been tested for multiple years and in all kinds of harsh conditions, I therefore think that we end up with Tesla getting to market slower, but with a solution that the end customer is really going to enjoy. I wanted to thank you I saw some comments go by. Jerry was here. We're really trying to focus more on the show because most of our viewers tend to get on our case about answering questions or viewing other things during. Very much looking forward to any and all comments that you might have that are constructed at the end of the show. Please take time to like and subscribe. If you can support on Patreon, that would be appreciated as well. Also remember 25 leg lifts a day with each leg to make sure you strengthen your leg muscles. Also remember, don't go to bed within 2 hours of eating, preferably 4 hours to let the food digest so it doesn't cause acid reflux issues. This is Greg for Tesla Fan Insight. We actually look forward to getting an opportunity to get your input on our BYD surrenders to Tesla comments. In German, we say Tschüss, French, au revoir, Hebrew, Lahitraot, Choda Hafez, in Farsi, Ni hao ma, Chinese, Zdravstvuyte, Russian. In Jamaica, we say Enough respect, wa good man. Thanks for saying hello, Roger, Jerry, et al. We appreciate all of you taking time out to join us, and we look forward to getting an opportunity at our next show to cover more what's going on in electric. And Josh, I saw you out there as well. Wanted to shout out, say hello. Again, looking forward to your after show comments. Have a great day and bye for now. And thanks once again for joining us.